Hello, everyone. By my watch and my laptop clock, it's 22. So I think it's time to start the second part of this session, which is using your sound recording, ideas for using your sound recordings. Now, in this session, I'm not going to be able to touch on absolutely every single way it's possible to use sound recordings. So I'm going to leave time at the end. We've got plenty of time, in fact, for a Q&A. And if those of you attending have come up or have used or know about anything that's complementary to what I'm saying, or other techniques, devices, ways of doing things, then please do add them in the Q&A at the end. We can turn it into a sharing event. But I'm going to run through some of the issues around using your sound recordings. And roughly, this session will cover raising awareness of your recordings, audiences, access and general issues. And then I'm going to specifically look at using audio recordings for reminiscence work, some creative responses with a quick word about ethics at the end. And as I say, I'm going to leave plenty of time for you to add some of your thoughts and opinions on this as well. Okay, these first few slides are fairly obvious, I guess. The reason I wanted to mention awareness is that one of the perennial problems with those of us who look after sound archives or have sound collections is raising awareness of their existence or of how to use them. Again, those of us who work with sound recordings know the content is marvelous. There is some really, really good content in the wide variety of sound collections out there. But does anyone else know about them? Do they know where they are, what's in them, how they can listen to them? Our experience is no, which is one of the reasons for this project. It's and our attempts to raise awareness. Within local galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, it's surprising. Is it surprising? I don't know. We've been slightly surprised that people aren't aware of the sound collections that they hold in their own archives or museums quite often. So basically, the more you can let people know about what exists, what you have, what you're working with, the better. And raising awareness, I think, is an important part of actually using sound archives. So I'm going to mention the obvious things. Social media is really useful. Helen Foster, who's currently managing the East Midlands Oral History Archive, has done a great job on Twitter and also on a regular blog that she keeps. And of course, on Twitter, it is possible to put sound clips up on Twitter. You have to create little videos. It doesn't like sound by itself, but when done well, it can be extremely effective, and people do get very good responses when sound clips, often with a little transcript of the words, are put up on Twitter. There are many, many websites, a couple of which I'm going to mention as I go through this presentation. Many websites that will present sound. There are some that are specifically all about sound, and SoundCloud is one of those. There are others. There are websites like History Pin and similar ones where you can pin sounds to specific places. Lots more. You're probably aware of your favorites. I like having a dedicated website as well. The example I've got on the screen is the London Sound Survey. There could be many others, but if a dedicated site is created and maintained and looked after and is on the web for any period of time, then it does gain listeners and has a certain legacy through being around for some time. One example of the fragility of websites is when institutions decide to change from one platform or system to another. So here at the University of Leicester, we used a system called Plone for many years, and the East Midlands Oral History Archive had many, many resources there. And in the change to the new web system, quite a few of those have been lost. And the new web system doesn't support sound. So all the sound has had to be moved onto SoundCloud. And you see where I'm going with this. The web is great, but it does need to be maintained and looked after. So raising awareness, I think, is a really important part of using your sound collections. Who is your audience? Well, I'm not going to, some of you from archives, libraries, museums will know far better than I who your audience is. But specifically for sound collections, everyone should be a potential audience, whether it's a visitor to your institution in person and or online. Sound, I was initially thinking of oral histories when I put together this slide, but actually there are so many different forms of sound. It could equally apply to the people I've got here, but specifically for oral histories, local historians, family historians, academics, other professionals from the galleries, libraries, archives and museums background. Very, very useful in learning of all sorts, whether it's in schools or at universities, adult education. Sound can work extremely well for that. Artists of all sorts can use sound as source material. Specifically, oral histories can be used because they are stories, which work extremely well in all forms of art. But whether you're thinking about radio broadcasts, wildlife sounds, sound effects, things like that, they all work well with artists. Care environments, as I'm going to talk about later, sound is used a lot in that, specifically if you're working in a reminiscence background with people with dementia. Music works particularly well, that's been noted, and I'll come back to that later. I put in tourists as well, ancestral or otherwise, and as I will mention later, there is this booming industry in audio tours, which is moving into sound installations as well. So although I suspect we're mostly talking about oral histories, sound archiving is not just about oral histories. There's plenty of other sound out there, and that can be used in any number of ways. However, access is an issue. So there's this big question when it comes to using your sound: how easily can people find and then listen to your recordings? And it's something I mentioned in the first slide. For example, do you have a searchable catalog of any sort? Do you have anything online that can aid people in finding what they might be interested in? The oral historian Doug Boyd, in an article a few years ago, said really with young people, they just want to click and play. And that's easy to say. It's not always easy to do, even online. So you've got to be able to find this stuff. So there's a certain amount of curation that needs to go into it online. And that may also be the case in an institution, actually in a building as well. If people can find your sound, if they're aware of what it is, where it is, what's in it, how are they going to listen to it if they come to your building, for example? Have you got listening posts of any sort? The British Library are going to be investing in those. Are we still talking about CD players, or dare I even say cassette players? We know from the Unlocking Our Sound Heritage project that many recordings are still sitting on cassettes or even reel-to-reel tape. And the whole point of this project is that reel-to-reel tape recorders are becoming scarcer. They're breaking down. Cassette players, you can still buy those, but they are increasingly rare. Has everything been copied onto CD? Maybe you reached the point where you can just call it up on your system and someone can sit down at a dedicated terminal, put on some headphones and have a listen to something. There's everything in between, from the humble cassette player right through to listening from a computer system, a server system. It helps if you have summaries or transcripts, of course. How available are they? Have they been scanned? Can you call them up quickly? Of course, here we're talking about oral histories, but if you have an extensive collection of wildlife sounds, it helps to have descriptions of those available. Radio programs, much the same thing as well. Have you got a guide to what is in the radio program? It's not the same as actually listening to the recording if there's speech involved, but it is extremely useful. It's nice to have short transcripts online if you're using sound clips as well. It's useful for people who can't hear well. We always used to say it's useful for people with bad internet connections, and we have to remember there still are many bad internet connections out there. It's useful for doing word searches as well. Of course, the transcription process, for those of you who have created word-for-word transcripts will know that takes time, eats up resources, and in the work I've done over the last 10 to 20 years, we've never really had the resources to create word-for-word transcripts, so we've gone for detailed summaries. They are extremely useful as aids to listening to sound recordings. It may well be, Mandeep has had to work with some oral histories that are 9 hours long, for example. If the bit you want is somewhere in the middle, it really helps to have a written guide as to where exactly it is. And as I've noted there, that's useful for online as well. There are also these issues around permissions. And this will crop up in a future slide when it comes to artists using sound clips as well. What do you have permissions for people to actually listen to these things on site? And it's been mentioned in one of the questions or online. So that's another issue as well. Okay, here's a few practical tips about creating sound clips. So it's obvious to say, but as someone who has listened to sound clips that don't work at all well, let's say the obvious. Sound clips should be of good sound quality. If they're very hissy, bitchy, noisy, or whatever, people will not listen to them for very long. And they shouldn't be too long. And I raised my hand as someone who is guilty of creating sound clips that are too long, on the basis that if someone is interested, they'll listen to all of it. But that might not always be the right attitude, particularly if you're creating something for use in a gallery, for example. However, it is possible for these clips to be too short as well. And I'm not going to mention the museum that I'm thinking of by name, but they created sound clips that in some cases were less than 10 seconds long. And you pick up the headset, listen to it, and it was over just like that. It piqued your interest, as far as anything that's less than 10 seconds long can, but there was nothing more. They were too short, far too short. Rule of thumb is up to 3 minutes. That might be true actually up to 2 minutes. It's amazing what you can fit into 60 seconds when it comes to a tightly edited sound clip. But you can trial and test them. Ideally, they would be interesting, and they should certainly be relevant within the context that they're being displayed. Should you use original recordings? Or you might say, why wouldn't you? Well, they might be poor quality. Now, it is possible to remove a lot of hiss using sound editing software, and you can actually do remarkable things with that. But they may not be salvageable. You might be able to pick out what people are saying, but it might require a lot of effort. So there are definitely issues around the clarity of original recordings. So, for example, with oral histories, might you want to use someone else to revoice them, an actor or a staff member? The advantage of that is it'll be absolutely clear. You've got a lot of control. You can read the words of the original person. You might not get their original accent, though, and the way they've spoken, which is always nice because, of course, then you get the regional differences in your, this is oral history recordings again. However, there might be a lack of authenticity, as I've just mentioned, a lack of dialect, a lack of good pronunciation. Some people do this, though. The approach will depend on the circumstances, and there's also this choice about, are you going to use sound effects? Any of you who have worked with people from a radio background will know it's almost impossible for radio people not to stick sound effects onto things. I always think there's a slight issue, particularly if you're presenting sound in a building or in a room that already has background noise in, that if you have sound, whether it's music or things happening and there's a voice involved, it's very easy for the voice to be masked. So I would recommend being careful with the use of background noise, even though sometimes it can work extremely well. An example of that might be, say you're at a tramway museum, listening to the voice of a tram driver on a headset, and the voice of and the noise of a tram, the bell, the click on the rails comes up as well. That's really great. That will work extremely well. So it's all about context. And use MP3s for delivery on the web or at an exhibition. There's absolutely no need to use archival WAV WAV files. Use MP3s, and if the original recording was of high quality, then you should be able to use quite small MP3s. which is always useful. Okay, this is a screenshot of Audacity sound editing software. It's one of the Reaper is another. It's not the only free one out there. It works well. It's free. There's been a little bit of controversy about it recently because, which I haven't followed closely, but there's been a slight issue with it sending user information off to its owners that some people are not happy about. So you might want to look into that. But it's very widely used. It works really well. And if you're doing a project that involves sound in any way, whether it's music, speech, then actually learning how to use Audacity and how to create clips is great fun. I've run several sessions on how to use Audacity. People really enjoy it. And it's for making podcasts and things like that. And it's a great skill that you can take away and apply to all forms of sound creation, sound editing. You can pay money for more sophisticated sound editing software, but to start off with, to learn the basics, I thoroughly recommend Audacity or Reaper or one of the other free ones. Okay, now accessing sound, playing sound in a building where there are other sounds and other things going on is always tricky, and this is not the A to Z of how to do it. Here's just a few thoughts. Standalone sound players do come in a wide variety of designs, and those of you from a museums or galleries background will know you can pay an awful lot of money for some of these. I remember 10 years ago being quoted £1,000 for a dial telephone system, which we thought was crazy. So I went out and bought a few MP3 players for £20 from the local Maplins, I think, and we bought a few of those and passed those out to users, and they work perfectly well. So I've noted there some MP3 players are really cheap, and indeed for one-off exhibitions, you can £25 will buy you an MP3 player in a loudspeaker, charge it up, put an hour's worth of sound on a loop, and that will play for most of the day in a corner. The difficulty, of course, is sound moving from one part of an exhibition to another. So this is where headphones come in useful. I have to give a plug when it comes to portable handsets to Ashby de la Zouch Museum, who very ingeniously adapted aids for the visually impaired. And if any of you have seen the little sound pens where you can have a code on a tin of tomatoes, and if you can't see well, you can put the pen up against the can or the tin and it will say, this is a tin of tomatoes. And you can use the same technology in your museum. You just put the code in the cabinet or on the wall or whatever, and this little pen will play some sound when you touch it to the wall or the cabinet. So I'm mentioning that as a really interesting, inspired way of reusing technology in a very cheap, affordable, yet workable way. The photo is of a student exhibition that was done at the University of Leicester, and that's an iPad in an iPad container. Everyone's using these at the moment. It's a nice way of presenting images or sound. And QR codes are increasingly being used more now. I thought they disappeared, but they've come back, so QR codes work well. And so many people have smartphones now that QR codes can link directly to sound that you've put up on the web, and they will link to smartphones. But I'm repeatedly told off because, of course, many visitors don't have smartphones, and that is true. Headphones do enable you to move through an exhibition so that you can listen to sound and not have sound from outside bleed in. If you've got as much money as the V&A, the Victoria and Albert, you can have headphones that change the sound when you move from room to room. This may get expensive, but I'm going to mention something later that might be a way around this, or a way of doing it at any rate. So you will have the way in your gallery, library, archive, or museum that you display sound or play sound. It's always worth looking into other ways that it can be done. What works for you will, of course, depend on your circumstances. Okay, here's just a few examples. This is recreating an afternoon of tea, which came out of a project at the Royal College of Art. And you can see the woman sitting in the chair actually has two old-style telephone handsets, one to each ear. And this is because one of them is playing the sound of tea, which is all the click clack of the cups and the pouring of the tea, and the other is playing people talking about drinking tea, and she's listening to both of them at the same time there. They are connected to an iPod. If you remember iPods, it's an MP3 player. It's under the chair. I can't remember if it was plugged into the mains or whether it was running on battery. Really simple. The telephone bits just had a connection on the end and plugged straight into it, and you can buy these telephone handsets. So I thought that worked really nicely. I can't remember if we were allowed to drink the tea or not, but it just worked, and it worked well. At the same exhibition from the Royal College of Art, this is a sonic quilt. The artist coined the phrase memory foam. Basically, this is a quilt that has little metal sensors sewed into it. And when you touch the particular squares that have the sensors, that triggers a sound clip. And one of those photos shows a cylindrical loudspeaker that is literally just placed behind the quilt. And it shows the little electric device there that is sewn into the quilt that then triggers the sound that's played through the speaker. This is actually quite cheap technology. It comes from a company called Bear Conductive, who do things like electrical paint and things like that. And they do quite cheap, affordable stuff through to something that you might need a grant for that's many hundreds of pounds, all to do with this sort of touch and play. Going back to this chap Doug Boyd I mentioned a while back, you just want to press it and listen. Well, this sort of technology enables you to do that, and that's the company called Bear Conductive. There may well be other companies out there. And finally, here's an online version. This is the sort of thing you'll be very familiar with. It's a sound map of Leicestershire and Rutland. It was created by workplace students doing a work placement with us at the university, and it uses a website called Omica, and it is taking a map, sticking a pin in the map, and connecting a sound clip to it. So there they've found a photograph of a village called Hungerton. They've put a bit of explanatory text in, and if you press on that, that will take you to either a sound recorded in Hungerton by a member of the village, or one from the archive, or an oral history clip. I'm not quite sure which it is, but it could be any one of those things. And that works quite nicely as well. Okay, here's a couple of more specific examples of recent projects. Reminiscence Resources. Those of you who are as old as me, if there is anyone out there as old as me, will remember the 1980s and Age UK starting up memory boxes and reminiscence boxes. And I remember creating cassettes of memories to go in these memory boxes. And then I didn't hear anything back from local Age UK and other people for some time. I was very keen to use our sound archives for Reminiscence Resources. So we've done that with the Unlocking Our Sound Heritage project locally. I think this works well in partnerships. We know music works very well in reminiscence work. But the thinking about this was, if you look at, for instance, online resources that the BBC have created, they have put on material about big events. So the coronation of the Queen, England winning the World Cup in 1966, a man landing on the moon, that sort of thing. Well, I wanted more local things, and I wanted it in local accents. This is using not just oral history collections, but certainly our Leicestershire and Rutland oral history collections. People talking about places, events in a local accent. So I teamed up with Leicestershire County Council for this, who have a proven track record in reminiscence work. And these resources are now up on the Culture Leicestershire website. And this is an example of kitchen sounds bingo, basically. And if you play the sound clip on the bottom right of the screen, it says, "Take a listen, washing up." It's a combination of people talking about the kitchen, cooking, with the sounds of things that go on in the kitchen, in this case, washing up. And this is combined with activity information that you can download as a PDF, advice on how to use the sound, how to use any pictures that are in the information pack, ideas for questions that and discussions that it can prompt. And in this particular instance, there are some bingo cards as well. So as you hear the sound in the kitchen, you can play bingo because there's a little thing set up for that. Very flexible sounds. They work in a number of different ways. As well as this, oopsie. Let me just go on to the next slide. There we go. That's the background information about it. Volunteers helped create the audio clips. That was one of the nice things about this project. We put out a call for people to use their mobile phones to collect sounds in their kitchen or in their living room or out in the garden. And they were used in two different ways. One of them was to create these reminiscence resources that were then tested in online reminiscence sessions, and they had to be online because of COVID. And as I say, they used a mixture of voice and sounds. They were still used with pictures and the usual things that you use in reminiscence work. The other crowdsourcing of sounds part of the project was just to create short PowerPoints that could be put onto YouTube as videos on, for example, the sounds of play. And that actually was where what the sounds of a kitchen was one of them. And that was 3 photos and a sound recorded by a volunteer that lasted up to 2 minutes. And they work quite well as well. Quite apart from reminiscence work, they work really well as discussion starters in heritage or history sessions and things like that. Okay, so that's local sound archives creating reminiscence resources aimed at local people, but of course useful for others as well. And you can target particular audiences depending on what sound you have or whether you've got the resources to go out and create new sounds. Okay, I'm going to move on to what I've called creative uses. I'm not sure if that's the best way of phrasing it, but let's say more creative uses than some of the previous ones. This is animation at any rate. I really, really like it when people take a short clip of someone talking and put an animation to it. These are 2 examples. I'm going to have a go at playing you the first one off YouTube, which I always hate doing with these sorts of software because it usually goes wrong, but it's only short and I'll give it a go. What we've got here is one from the Invercargill Public Library and one from a project called Live Borders on the buses. I'm going to play you the first one about apricots, and you can see the differences. One is a cartoon and the one on the right is stop frame animation using little cutout drawings that kids made for the project. Okay, let's see if I can play you the first one. Let's see what happens.
Trees.
Oh, yes, he had a marvelous orchard.
Did he?
Apricots, pears,
Apricots.
apples. Yes, the apricots didn't do all that well.
But they'd be stewing.
Yes.
Stew them up.
And plums, miles of plums and cherries.
And what about small fruits?
Gooseberries and blackcurrants and all the wee fellas that we bought apricots years later.
Yes.
But in my early days, I don't remember us ever seeing any bought fruit except for oranges at Christmas. We'd get an orange in our sock at Christmas time.
Oh, how wonderful.
It was wonderful.
Okay, and I'm back. I finally unmuted myself. There we go. I hope you could see that. We've had a few issues with this software before. Yeah, animation.
Hello, everyone.
Sorry?
Happy 4th of July, America.
Oh, hello.
I'm Candice Min Kwan. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm thrilled to share with you the world premiere of America Beautiful.
So, oh dear, oh dear. Okay, I don't know if you could hear that, but that was YouTube continuing on to the next video, which I could hear. I don't know if you could. Next. Okay, always worth checking out what the British Library are doing with sound. Here are 2 projects that I wanted to highlight. The first one is If Walls Had Ears, which is a really nice website that again uses animation and takes its sound from the collections at the British Library, and it's about voices of the home. So they've taken rooms, the obvious rooms, the living room, the kitchen, the bathroom, the bedroom, and they've sourced people talking about these rooms, describing them, the things that go on in those rooms, memories of them. And they've used some really charming little animation to go with it as well. And the end effect is this house of memories and sounds. Really, really effective, works very well indeed. And the idea of bringing artists in to work with sound is always one that I encourage. So the British Library invited a hip hop artist, Awate, to come in and work with their collections to create a piece of music. So this is what the British Library has said in this quote, is an innovative blend of modern hip hop production techniques and experimental storytelling. It works really well. It's called the Unearthed Odyssey, and you can find it online. But this is the point where I mention, again, these issues about access that can sometimes become an issue for creating things like this. And that is, the artist is let loose on the archive, the collection, the sound recordings, says, oh, I love that one, I want to use that one. And you look it up and you say, oh no, we can't use that, that's closed for so many years, or this has this issue with it, or something like that. So these things usually become a process of negotiation where you have to find the recordings that can be used in a particular way. And in this case, of course, they managed to find plenty, and it's well worth listening to. This, I find, is an issue a lot of the time. It doesn't mean that you can't use material, but it's something that you need to be alive to. Okay, and finally, on creative uses, well, what I think I'm right in calling geofencing and audio tours. This is a website, Echoes, and I was involved with a project that did exactly this 5 years ago, and this is one of my warning things about the web, which I've mentioned before, and I'll come to this. What you're looking at with the little blue circles, they indicate where your phone will pick up different sounds relating to buildings on the campus of Coventry University. So basically, as you walk around with your phone or mobile device, you move in and out of sound bubbles, as I think of them, which I'm guessing is the way it works at the Victoria and Albert when they put your headphones on and you move from one room to another. It's just very, very local there. This is on a broader canvas, a campus canvas, if you will. We did this about 5 or 6 years ago in the Cultural Quarter in Leicester, and I loved it. We created new sounds, we went out and recorded new sounds, and the public did as well. And then we found or imagined older sounds from 50 years ago. So we found old buses, old cars, and recorded those and created different layers. So imagine with the blue circles, there are red circles, which indicate the sounds of the past. And so the user was able to walk through the area listening to current sounds. And you might say, well, why didn't they just listen? And that raises a whole other interesting point about doing this sort of thing, how you are capturing sounds that become historical the second you've captured them. But we also had these sounds that represented the area as it was 50 years ago. And in this particular case, it was a highly industrialized area, which it isn't now. So we sourced a lot of sounds of industry. I loved it. It worked terrifically well. You can't even see it on the internet anymore. It's disappeared. The app was created, it was put on Apple's App Store, and then they took it down a couple of years later because they'd changed the requirements, and it was never refreshed. So those of you who have worked with websites and done stuff and seen them disappear will know how I feel about that. But this can be a really effective way of creating audio tours. Of course, you have to have a smart device. Not everyone has that. But I'm throwing it out as a nice idea. Okay, I'm just going to draw to a close here with a quick word about legalities and ethics. And the first bullet point there is, just before you embark on using all your sound, are you aware of all the issues that Mandeep has run through? Do you actually have permission to use this sound? What permissions do you have? Is it worth trying to contact the rights holder? Have you used sound in a way that is consistent with the permissions you have? These are all things we've covered before. So, does the sound clip or extract accurately reflect the intention of the creator or creators? Is there sufficient context? And in the case of an oral history, what I'm thinking of here is when you take a sound clip, say, a short sound clip from a longer oral history, have you accurately reflected the intention of the speaker? I think the BBC reporter Laura Kunsberg got in trouble for badly editing a piece about Jeremy Corbyn, where he had said he was in favour of something, but she presented it as if he wasn't in favour of it. And that comes from doing things really quickly in a hurry. And I nearly did that for an online exhibition. I was in a hurry, and I caught it in time. I also had created a sound clip through editing that didn't reflect actually what the speaker had said. So there's this ethical imperative to reflect properly, accurately, not to misrepresent the speaker in the case of oral histories, and potentially, if you're using other forms of sound, the creator's intent with that as well. There's another issue I want to bring up about websites as well. Are you happy with the terms and conditions of a website if you're going to use it? Now, we've all, a lot of us have put sound up onto SoundCloud. Goodness knows I've used YouTube a lot over the years. People are having second thoughts about the terms and conditions. I'm not sure if the British Library are putting any more sound onto SoundCloud. I may be wrong. The basic issue is a lot of the websites' terms and conditions state that they will be able to use the material in various ways to promote their website and possibly to pass on to third parties. And that's where you just need to be a little bit careful that you understand exactly what you're signing up to. This is why I like the idea of dedicated websites that I mentioned right back at the beginning of the presentation. And I'm going to use the example of the East Midlands Oral History Archive recordings on the University of Leicester's Special Collections Online. This is a website that Special Collections control. So we know that details aren't being passed on to anyone else at any time at all. I mentioned before there are around 450 of these recordings. We've put around 400 online because 50 of them we didn't think was suitable for putting online. And we put them up under Creative Commons license. And there's some interesting developments with the National Lottery Heritage Fund and Creative Commons, which I won't go into at the very moment. But basically, we have control over those. We can control whether we want people to download them or not. We have control over the license we put them out under, and that works really nicely. Okay, this is a bullet point list of all the uses you might want to put oral history and other sound recordings to. Working in partnerships helps a lot. Does anyone do audio newsletters? They're called podcasts now, aren't they? Bulletins, talks, lectures, podcasts, books. I thought I'd removed cassettes. Never mind. CDs, DVDs, websites, audio tours, learning, education, exhibitions, interpretations, reminiscence work we've mentioned. Works very well on radio. There's this sort of whole thing of sound collages, which artists do. Oral histories in particular, because I've said that before, they're stories. They work fantastically well as source material for drama, for dance, theatre, poetry, digital storytelling. And I've got to plug the Oral History Society's Creative Oral History Group webpage here. And they have highlighted projects that cover creative writing, photography, reminiscence theatre, and artworks. And although I've mentioned oral history here, it doesn't have to be oral history. Sound can also be used in all these ways as well. And mixtures often work particularly well. Okay, that's me done. It's a whistle-stop tour through. I know there are loads more examples I could have looked at and quoted, but I will throw this back at you slightly as the attendees. Please ask if you've got any questions about anything I've mentioned, but is there anything you've seen that's inspired you or worked very well? Any techniques or ideas you'd like to share in the chat, or any issues that I've not covered that you feel you'd like to have covered? Please dive in with any questions.